Thank you so much. And thank you for the kind invitation. I had the pleasure of meeting Helen over the summer in Buffalo, New York, of all places. And I'm really grateful to be here. I made some slides only because I think it's great when people don't look at me. Is it possible for me to share my screen? Okay. I just like taking the pressure off of all the Zoom faces.
Yeah.
Um, so I will do that and let's see if we can. Oh, Zoom always hides all the things I need. Um, there we go. So I thought I'd say a little bit about sort of how I came to talk about this today in relationship to my work on transplant, because this actually goes back to the paper that Helen was kind enough to comment on over the summer, and it's a worry that I have about the relationship between bioethics and philosophy. It's something that has been motivating a lot of my kind of background thinking over the last few years. And a lot of the worry that I have about this relationship between bioethics and philosophy came from work on transplant ethics. And so I'll say a bit about that and then say a little bit about some current innovations. And I saw that Alan Schumann joined us, and I very much hope he will give his 2 cents on some of these topics that I think raise really interesting and important questions that we often ignore in bioethics, or at least try to ignore, and then have time for discussion. So this background problem of that I see is kind of tension between bioethics and philosophy. There's been a number of philosophers who work in bioethics, myself included, who have raised these questions saying, look, there are all these substantive issues in bioethics. They involve metaphysics, epistemology, ethical theory, phenomenology, social and political philosophy that are really central to the kinds of topics that get addressed in bioethics. There are all kinds of ways in which these concepts, things like freedom and voluntariness and autonomy and rights and good and bad and interests, exploitation, justice, all are the kinds of concepts that philosophers try to disambiguate, try to draw distinctions, try to articulate clear definitions of, try to map, and sort of the work of philosophers in terms of mapping arguments to identify premises, to detect fallacies, to describe, premises and their logical conclusions are all really, really important to kind of addressing these questions in bioethics. But that kind of work often leads people to find that they disagree, or that positions that they really wanted to defend are maybe not defensible, or at least not defensible for the ways that they've defended them. And that's sort of contrary to what I often think of as happening in bioethics, which is often sort of writ large. I think there's been an attempt to kind of fill the void that was left by radical secularization in the West, and the sort of chaos of substantive moral pluralism by trying to do things like, let's come to consensus on these points, right? What we may or may not do, or should not do, to offer really practical answers to specific questions that arise in healthcare and health policy, but really in the service of particular goals. And so the idea, I think, often in bioethics is, yes, there's all this background disagreement, but surely we can figure out the way to do this and move forward and advance a particular end, and then have that appear to be defensible, right? Because we've used a committee, or there's been discussion, or there's been some sort of thing that lends legitimacy to those conclusions, making them enforceable. And if you're trying to do that, then having the really clear, careful work of philosophical thinking can get in the way of that, because it might show things that are problematic and lead people to disagreements. So over the years, it has struck me that there's a real attempt in bioethics to do a lot of hand waving when it comes to these deep philosophical and religious questions. So a lot of the issues that come under discussion in bioethics turn on these issues and these questions, and yet there's an effort to kind of ignore that and make that go away, because that's sort of messy and not what we're trying to accomplish in bioethics. So what I want to look at today is a couple of different sort of recent innovations in transplant that I think raise really important old questions that we've never really settled, and we've tried to kind of set aside or pretend like we've settled them, and yet they keep coming back, and it keeps emerging that these fundamental questions actually really matter. And then, like I said, I'd love to hear from you. So I'll start with one of the questions that crosses numerous areas of something happened here. Numerous areas of transplant, and then look at some other recent developments. So there's this long-standing issue in transplant of the question of who's dead, right? How do we know it? And how sure do we have to be that they're dead in order to use someone as an organ donor? These questions are largely motivated by the assumption, which is no longer uniformly shared, that unpaired vital organs should only be removed from people who are dead, or that people should not be killed for their organs, right? Those are two versions of the so-called dead donor rule. And the people that are most obviously dead, right? They're cold and they've not been breathing for a good long while, are not suitable donors. And so the question is, we need to find, how do we find people who are closer to the line between living and dead, but over it, in order to use them as organ donors? Finding out who those people are turns very importantly on the question of where the line is. So what is death? Who is dead? But also on epistemological questions about how we know things and how certain we have to be about certain kinds of knowledge in order to act on that or treat it as knowledge. So what definitions of death are appropriate and mechanisms for determining who are dead are really fundamental questions in transplant. But part of answering those questions depends on knowing how we understand death, on a concept of death. And more recently, there's been a lot of attention to the question of what may be done to the people who are nearly dead, including not only questions about, may you give people who are potential donors things like heparin to facilitate donation, but even to the point of people asking, maybe we can kill the nearly dead for their organs, and they could die, in fact, by organ donation. So over the years, these questions have been at the heart of efforts to define and redefine death in terms both of traditional circulatory and respiratory criteria, as well as neurological criteria. The advent of donation after circulatory death raised questions about how long doctors had to wait after the heart had stopped to pronounce death. That became especially important a number of years ago when Denver Children's Hospital used some neonates to become heart donors after only 90 seconds after they had stopped breathing and their hearts had stopped. That protocol also raised a lot of questions about sort of the use of circulatory and respiratory criteria for determining death, because after all, the hearts started again. And so some people started to wonder, what's the difference here? And so that was a time when we saw a lot of shift in language from saying that circulation and respiration had irreversibly stopped to saying that they had permanently stopped. So that language shift has happened because of those questions. But that led to a lot of additional sort of discussion and controversy. More recently, in particular in the US, there was a large effort to potentially refine the definition of death using neurological criteria. And that process seems to have come to a screeching halt, because there was such disagreement in the group of people who were working on that. The development of normothermic regional perfusion, which I'll say more about in a moment, is also raising significant questions about who is dead and who is not dead, and who might have been dead and is no longer dead. There are also people asking whether the nearly dead, as I said earlier, are suitable organ donors. So those are just a few examples of things that have been happening recently in sort of the transplant world that and not so recently, that continue to force us to ask these questions about who is dead, how do we know, how sure do we have to be, and what may we do to people who are dead but not the living, et cetera. This has been an ongoing challenge in transplant, and I think every time we see some of these new approaches develop, these questions come back again and again, and it's really hard to ignore the fact that we've never actually solved the problem or settled the question, and I'm not sure that we can. So I'll say a little bit more about normothermic regional perfusion, or NRP, since it's an area of current debate. This is a procedure that's used to facilitate organ donation, including heart donation sometimes, from donors who are declared dead using circulatory criteria. In the US, the Uniform Determination of Death Act, some version of which exists in most states, refers to, allows death to be declared using circulatory or neurological criteria. And with respect to circulatory criteria, it refers to the irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. So NRP involves declaring a patient dead using circulatory and respiratory criteria, and then restarting circulation in the body so that the organs continue to receive oxygenated blood. The key is that what's number 4 in this diagram is that they clamp before restarting circulation. They clamp the arteries that take blood to the brain so that the brain, at least presumably, does not receive oxygenated blood. So unlike in the Denver case where they did not intend to restart circulation, they just waited a very short amount of time before removing the organs. In this case, the intention is to restart circulation, and people who are involved in this practice make a lot of number 4 in the diagram, that they're not restarting circulation to the brain, and so therefore it's not like they're restarting circulation really. And then there are people who have opposed this practice precisely because of that. They said, look, it's become a major controversy. There was an article in the New York Times recently kind of highlighting the disagreement between 2 hospitals in New York City who are doing it. So does restarting circulation mean that the original death declaration was sort of false or erroneous? Or does this process sort of somehow undo that declaration? Does restarting circulation but clamping the arteries mean that physicians, in fact, are actually causing death by presumably leading to neurological death by cutting off the supply of oxygen to the brain, much like smothering a patient would be, so that they stop breathing? In other words, is intentionally cutting off circulation to the brain a form of killing? People who defend this practice say, no, it's not, because the person's already dead. Others are worried that the original diagnosis of death may in fact be undone or have been wrong in the first place, because circulation is restarted. And the only reason the brain doesn't receive oxygenated blood is that it's been intentionally cut off from the body in this way. So if that's the case, then is the person ultimately becoming a donor after having been declared dead using neurological criteria? But I'll note that in the US, no one who is doing this procedure actually checks for brain death or evaluates the patients to declare them dead using neurological criteria, because they're relying on the first declaration of death. So there are obviously lots and lots of questions here about the definition of death, but there's also philosophical questions about action and intention, about the role of intentions in defining actions, in ascribing responsibility, and so on. And some of the debate that goes on about NRP right now reflects often unspoken assumptions about ethical theory, with very clear differences between physicians who say, look, people who defend the view that physicians may not kill patients, even if good may come of it, and some consequentialists who are saying, look, we're going to save lives this way, or improve transplant outcomes. That justifies the act, even if we're playing around with death of it. An additional wrinkle that I really don't have a lot to say about, because it's not something I have studied in depth, but is the fact that I understand that in Belgium, there have been some cases of using NRP after euthanasia deaths in order to procure organs, which raises some additional interesting questions. But a lot of this turns on our understanding of death, on our understanding of killing, on an account of what we may and may not do with respect to the dead or the nearly dead, and what we may and may not do to the living. It's a very active debate in the literature right now. And I think this question of who is dead, who's alive, and what we may do to people based on where they fall in that line is a really challenging question that keeps coming up in transplant. And some of these new procedures sort of kind of raise that yet again. And I think I'm going to turn now to whole body transplantation, which I think also raises these kinds of questions and challenges. So things have been pretty quiet on this whole body, sometimes called head transplant issue, for a number of years. A few years ago, there was a lot of discussion in literature. There was the Wren and Canavero physician-scientist pair who kept saying that they were about to do the first whole body transplant or head transplant involving at least a living person. They claimed that they had already done it with cadavers, and they were allegedly preparing to do it with a cadaver and a living person, possibly in China, they were saying. So this is the practice that refers to the proposal to graft the head of a human onto the body of another human. It raises lots of ethical, social, legal questions, obviously. The proposal leads to questions such as, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a person to survive over time? Right? Personal identity over time issues have been long-standing in philosophy. We think back to the discussions of the ship of Theseus, right? What's the relationship between the material that constitutes the object and the object's identity over time? If you keep replacing the parts of the ship over time and you've replaced everything because it's all decayed, it's still the ship of Theseus, right? Why or why not? Long-standing sort of philosophical puzzle. And of course, humans are more complicated, right? We have not just pieces of wood, but we have memories, a conscience, a mind, a soul, and relationships. So things are even more complicated there. There's been a long-standing, like I said, history of inquiry into personal identity and philosophy, very, very crudely put. There's the people who give primacy to the brain, to the mind, to the soul, to the memories, to consciousness, sort of the so-called psychological continuity views. And then there are those that give primacy to the body or the organism, sort of the so-called animalists. I think it's fair to say that in the philosophical literature, the psychological continuity view is much more popular. But certainly there are animalists, and those views are well represented there too. And then there's kind of a middle path, like sometimes referred to as views that involve embodied, cognition. So the idea there is that the body plays an important role in cognition, in how we know and how we experience the world. It matters whether my head and my body are connected to each other. And so on those views, it's not all about the body or all about the brain, but it's both. But whole body transplantation might make the psychological continuity view, might make on that view, it might be possible that the person alive, if you take the embodied cognition view, the person alive after a successful whole body transplant is neither the original person whose head is used or the original person whose body is used, right? It's some new entity. And so that creates a whole other set of questions. So our take on personal identity has some really obvious and some probably not so obvious implications for this whole debate in the literature. But whether we adopt the psychological continuity view, the animalist view, or the embodied cognition view is going to really affect how we then take on this issue of whole body transplantation. It leads to different answers to the question of who, if anybody, is alive at the end. Is it the body source? Is it the head source? Is there a whole new person who is created? If we think of it as the body source who's alive at the end, then calling it a head transplant makes sense, much like somebody who receives a kidney transplant, somebody would receive a head transplant. But if we think it's the head source who's alive, then it's a whole body transplant, right? The person is receiving a whole body, much like they would have received a new lung. And if it's something altogether new, because we hold this embodied cognition view, then is this really a creation story? So beyond nomenclature, though, there's all different kinds of accounts of who is alive at the end of the process that have implications for the conditions under which it would be permissible to even do this procedure, for family relationships before and after, and for the role families should play in making these decisions. If no one is alive at the end, then we have to ask who died, when did they die, and how did they die? So these kind of philosophical puzzles about personal identity are really central to a whole range of questions around this proposal to do a whole body or a head transplant that fortunately I think has quieted down. But we can't apply our usual sort of bioethics machinery. So if we think about the research ethics machinery, if this were to be done as part of a research protocol, or if we were to talk about this is a form of surgical innovation, and we said, well, we have to sort of apply the kind of standards for innovative surgeries to this practice. We can't do that without answering some of those basic questions about who is who. So both research ethics and surgical innovation ethics require both the free and voluntary informed consent of people, typically, and they also require that the risks be reasonable in light of the anticipated benefits. But who is consenting and to what? Right? If we assume that the head source survives and the body source was dead before anything happens, then the head source has to give consent, but that person is consenting to decapitation in the hope of having their head reconnected to another body. If we think the body source is alive at the end, or that a third being comes into creation, then we've got additional questions, like who would be in a position to authorize this in the first place, and what exactly would they be authorizing? I mean, the head source would be consenting to be killed, truly. So there's lots and lots of questions. Standard requirements for evaluating a project include assessing risks and potential benefits. And again, depending on who we think is the anticipated survivor, we might evaluate who's exposed to risks and who's stands to benefit very, very differently. The primary risks and the potential benefits change depending on who might be the survivor or the newly created entity out of this whole procedure. If a new person comes into existence, then that person faces all kinds of unknown potential physical and psychological risks, and who would have had the authority to grant that in the first place. Whole body transplantation also raises all kinds of interesting questions about phenomenology. Are there some physical changes that are simply too significant to maintain one's identity over time? Right? Our bodies aren't just these material objects in the world. They are our bodies, and in some sense, they are part of who we are, expected to respect them, to care for them, and so on. So what is that lived experience if this were to even be done and work? There's also a lot of practical questions, obviously, about integrating the body and the brain physically. We see that with people who've received artificial limbs or people who've received a limb transplant. But there are real interesting questions about what it would take for the self to associate this new body as its own, right? Assuming that the head recipient is the survivor, the head source is the survivor. So what if the body of a man and the head of a woman or vice versa were grafted, right? How would that change the experience? Is there anything that is just too much? And there are, of course, all kinds of other questions, such as questions about family relationships, right? The genetic children of the survivor would be the genetic children of the body source, not of the head source. So there would be this bizarre sort of set of questions there. There's questions about who's married to whom and when, and all kinds of other questions. There's also questions about the authority of the state to regulate this activity, and so on. But sort of more social, political, philosophical questions. But the bottom line is that answering these kind of underlying questions matters. And we can't just get on with the usual business of bioethics, such as approving studies and endorsing or condemning practices, without at the very least making unspoken assumptions about these issues. And these are hardly settled matters. And so I want to say a little bit now about, Helen had asked that I talk about both body transplant and uterus transplant. So I want to make sure that I say a little bit about that. I think uterus transplantation raises really interesting questions about identity and relationships as well, about risks and their justification, about resource allocation, and many other things. So things have been fairly quiet on the uterus transplant front recently, and I think it's largely because the practice has continued very quietly. There's now an international registry that's optional, voluntary participation, but to record the procedures that are done. And this seems to be just sort of, there's several centers around the world that are doing it, and it's no longer the case that we're hearing about it every time somebody does one of these. It is currently portrayed as a treatment for women with uterine factor infertility. As of now, it is not done offered to transgender people or to facilitate pregnancy in males, but there already are people who've made a call for that, and particularly on the transgender issue, I think there's been substantive calls for that. So I think we'll continue to see that, and we'll see where that goes. But the thought of such applications raises questions about identity and motherhood, for example. What does the concept of motherhood entail? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a mother? Is it a cluster concept, such that meeting any number of a wide selection of criteria would suffice? This is something that Helen Watt and Anthony McCarthy, who are both here, I saw, have written about and argued that, if a biological male were to receive a uterus and be able to gestate a fetus in the future, that still would not somehow create a maternal bond. So there's lots of questions about the experience of motherhood, the meaning of motherhood, that I think uterus transplant raises. Our judgments about these matters are really going to affect how we respond to claims of people who say things like, I have a right to be a mother, or I have an interest in being a mother, and that somehow confers an interest in uterus transplantation or a right to a uterus transplant. The question of males receiving uterus transplant is but one among many questions that have been raised regarding who should be eligible for a transplant. There are questions about under what circumstances or women should be eligible or should be prioritized. For example, should women who already have biological children and lost their uteruses subsequent to a pregnancy be eligible? Should they have the same or lower priority? How many pregnancies may women attempt post-transplant? Should women who don't want to have children but claim that they need a uterus in order to feel whole be eligible? These are very deeply value-laden questions that depend on a number of factors, including how we might conceptualize the purpose or the end of uterus transplantation. There's been a lot of controversy in some circles about the requirement that women undergoing a uterus transplant have their own eggs that they've been able to freeze already and make sure that they could have genetically related biological children. There are women who argued that shouldn't prevent them. They should be able to use an egg donor or a donor embryo. There are all kinds of questions about who should be eligible to donate. One of these debates is at the very basic level of living versus deceased donors. Most uterus transplants, as I've been able to tell so far, have been done with living donors, at least the successful ones. And it seems that these may yield better outcomes for the recipients, but of course, donation carries risks to the living donors. And whether it's justifiable to expose living women to those risks for the purpose of donating a uterus is hardly a settled question. There's also a debate about using older versus younger donors. It seems that younger donors, younger living donors, will lead to better outcomes for the recipients. But of course, younger living donors have more at stake. If deceased donors are used, is any woman who had agreed to be an organ donor automatically eligible to be a uterus donor, or should this kind of require special permission, and who would have the authority to give that? So like whole body transplantation, uterus transplantation raises all kinds of interesting questions about about phenomenology and the experience of the body and the experience of pregnancy and the connection between our bodies and our identities and our children. It involves value judgments. It involves judgments about prioritizing healthcare spending, which people try to not talk about in bioethics often. We sort of like to leave that to the side, as if every topic were its own discrete topic. But these are really serious questions, and we sort of seem to want to kind of set them aside and move on. And I think we're seeing much of that same thing now with xenotransplantation. So this is obviously not a new concept, but it has been in the news quite a bit in recent years, and I think will continue to be. Xenotransplantation raises questions that cut across numerous domains in philosophy. There are certainly issues of phenomenology and metaphysics, for example. Does anything about xenotransplantation shape our understanding of the self, of the body, of what it is to be human? I'm reminded here of discussions about chimeras and people thinking about, well, what percentage of the cells would have to it have to have from a different species for us to start to think about it differently. I'm also reminded of people who have kind of religious or folk objections to organ transplantation or to the transplantation of at least particular organs, typically the heart, because of concerns about where the soul might reside. What makes us human, right? What makes us an individual human? These are these metaphysical questions about identity that we can't pretend are settled. They're not. There are phenomenological questions about the experience of living with a vital organ from an animal such as a pig. There have been really interesting reports in human-to-human transplants about people's experiences, recipients' experiences, for example, of taste changing foods that they didn't like before. They now like, and it turns out that was the donor's favorite food. People who have report things like changing personality, changing memories. I am really curious about the lived experience of embodiment. Should xenotransplant recipients start to live longer lives? What will that look like? What will that mean? Xenotransplantation also raises really significant questions about risks and potential benefits and their justifications, not only to recipients, but to society. Because of the risks associated with zoonosis, right? So animal to human transmission of potentially deadly viruses. Xenotransplant takes on a really important additional kind of social political philosophy level questions about the authority of the state, the role of the state in protecting public health, the risks that individuals may justifiably expose the public to, and so on. Right now, the risk of zoonosis appears to be low, but it's still a serious concern that several bodies have recommended that recipients be monitored for their life and possibly their close contacts, their family members, or people who live or spend a lot of time near them. Would it be permissible to require that? Would it be possible to require that? How would that be monitored and enforced? I mean, those are questions about political philosophy and the role of the state. There are also all kinds of issues connected to concerns about animal welfare, the moral status of animals, the permissibility of creating and killing animals for the purpose of extracting organs. Other questions turn on kind of ethical judgments that things like the allocation of resources, both at the macro level and at the micro level, right? So at the macro level, we might ask about whether we should be investing as a society into xenotransplant versus something else, right? Either another healthcare area, another area altogether, or at least other transplant research. At the micro level, we're certainly going to face questions about, who should be eligible, how should these be allocated. I'm part of a working group right now, and it's interesting on xenotransplantation, and it's really interesting to hear people talk about sort of ensuring fair access to xenotransplantation trials. And it sort of speaks of this as something that's really good and really promising and really desirable. And I think xenotransplantation is far from having shown itself to be the kind of thing that people should all think about as really desirable and something that they all want access to right now. But that seems to be how we get excited about research and research trajectories. And I think it's really important that we slow down and kind of look at these big picture questions. But the big picture questions, like I said, often get in the way of the moving along business. So my hope was really to prompt discussion of some of these deeper questions, whether they're ethical or otherwise, that these developments in transplant raise. I do not have answers to all of them. I am deeply curious about them. I also appreciate that they're really central to how we understand and evaluate practices, and try as we might to ignore them, these issues keep coming back. And I don't think that they should be ignored.